Mud, Mulch, and Miracles. Chapter 1. What Margaret inherits. I should tell you up front. I know absolutely nothing about gardening. I am a woman who, for 37 years of marriage, kept one potted plant on the kitchen windowsill. A succulent named Gerald. And even Gerald, if he could speak, would tell you he'd known better days. So when my husband Kenneth passed last autumn, and the solicitor read out his will in that dreadfully dry way solicitors do, I fully expected to inherit the usual things. The house on Pemberton Close, the slightly battered Volvo, possibly his inexplicable collection of novelty bottle openers. What I did not expect was to inherit Plot 14B of the Ashworth Road Community Garden. A half-acre strip of land that, as I was informed with the enthusiasm of someone describing a condemned building, had been lying fallow for approximately 3 years. Fallow. That is a generous word for what I found when I drove over on a drizzly Tuesday morning in March. Catastrophically abandoned felt closer to the truth. The botanical equivalent of a crime scene was what I muttered under my breath as I stepped out of the Volvo and surveyed the wreckage. Kenneth had apparently joined the Garden Society 6 years ago, during what I now understand was his secret midlife crisis phase. The same phase that produced the bottle openers and a brief, disastrous attempt at beekeeping. He'd paid his membership dues faithfully, visited the allotment approximately twice that I knew of, and then quietly stopped going without ever mentioning it to me. This was very Kenneth. He was a man of enthusiasms and dignified retreats. The plot itself was a spectacular mess. Waist-high weeds stretched from one end to the other, punctuated by the collapsed skeleton of a cold frame. 3 plant pots apparently being used as nesting sites by something with ambitions, and what I can only describe as a compost heap that had given up on the composting and simply become a hill. A rusted fork protruded from the earth at a jaunty angle, like a tiny, agricultural Excalibur. I stood at the edge of it all in my good coat. Because I had not yet understood that one does not wear one's good coat to these things. And I thought, right. What would a sensible woman do here? A sensible woman would probably surrender the plot back to the committee, accept a modest refund if one was offered, and go home to eat biscuits and watch something soothing on television. But I have never been entirely sensible. Kenneth always said so, with great affection. I pulled out my phone and typed, "How to restore a neglected allotment," into the search bar. 743 results. I put my phone away, looked at the rusted fork, and thought, well, we'll start there, then. What I did not know, could not have known, standing there in my good coat with mud already creeping onto my good shoes, was that this weedy, waterlogged disaster area was about to become the most unexpectedly consequential thing in my life since the day I married Kenneth Davies in the summer of 1987. Though considerably muddier. Chapter 2. Enter the Menace. I returned the following Saturday with appropriate footwear, a pair of gardening gloves I'd bought in a panic from the supermarket, and absolutely no plan whatsoever. This, I would later learn, is apparently the correct starting point for most amateur gardeners. The Ashworth Road Community Garden was busy on Saturdays. People nodded at me with the cautious friendliness of those who've learned not to get too attached to newcomers. A retired geography teacher named Dennis, who tended the immaculate plot next to mine with the intensity of a man managing a military campaign, surveyed my wilderness and gave me a look that said everything without saying anything at all. Then he handed me a wheelbarrow. "Start with the weeds," he said. "Don't think about anything else. Just the weeds." This was good advice. It was also, I discovered, advice that could absorb several hours without one noticing. There is something deeply satisfying about pulling a weed from the earth. The resistance, the give, the small triumph of holding the root aloft. I began to understand why people did this. I began, tentatively, to understand what Kenneth had been on about. I was deep in my third hour and absolutely filthy from the knees down, when I became aware that someone was watching me. He was leaning against the fence at the far end of the plot. A boy of perhaps 15 or 16, wearing a hoodie of indeterminate gray color, and the particular expression of profound boredom that teenagers have elevated to an art form. He was eating something from a paper bag, with the mechanical rhythm of someone who is technically eating but has spiritually left the premises. "You're doing it wrong," he said. I straightened up. My back made a sound like a floorboard. "I beg your pardon?" "You're leaving the roots in. They'll just come back." I looked at the weed in my hand. Then I looked at the boy. He had the look of someone who expected to be dismissed, who had in fact already pre-dismissed himself as a precaution. "Are you here with someone?" I asked. "My nan." He nodded vaguely in the direction of a stout woman with magnificent silver hair who was 3 plots over, engaged in what appeared to be open warfare with the courgette plant. "She makes me come on Saturdays. I'm not allowed to just sit at home, apparently." This last part was delivered with the specific grievance of someone quoting a sentence that had been repeated to them many times. "And what's your name?" I asked. A pause. "Tyler." "I'm Margaret. And you're right about the roots. Would you like to show me what you mean?" Another pause. Longer this time, freighted with the internal calculation of a teenager assessing whether helpfulness is compatible with their projected image. The paper bag crinkled. Then Tyler pushed off the fence, sighed in a way that suggested he was doing me an enormous favor, and stepped onto my plot. He showed me, with brisk efficiency, how to work the fork down alongside the root and lever it out whole. He knew what he was doing. He'd done this before. "You've gardened?" I said. "My granddad had an allotment." Before he. A pause. Before. I didn't push. I just nodded and watched, and when he handed me the fork back, I said, "Same time next week, if you can bear it?" He shrugged with heroic nonchalance. But he did look, for just a fraction of a second, like a boy who'd been asked something he hadn't expected. "Maybe," he said. "Whatever." Whatever, in the language of teenagers, I have since learned, means yes. Chapter 3. The education of both parties. Tyler came back. Of course he did. He came back the next Saturday and the one after that, always materializing at the fence at approximately the same time. Always with the affect of someone who has merely wandered over by accident and certainly has no intention of staying. He always stayed. He was, beneath the elaborate show of indifference, desperately keen. On the garden, on the work. On having somewhere to put his hands and his energy that wasn't a screen or a street corner. I did not say any of this aloud, obviously. I am 63, not completely without social awareness. What I did do was ask questions. Not the invasive kind. Not, "How are you really doing?" and What's troubling you, dear? The sort of questions that make teenagers vanish like startled deer. I asked about plants. I asked what his grandfather had grown, and whether courgettes were difficult, and what the difference was between a determinate and an indeterminate tomato. Tyler, it turned out, had opinions about tomatoes. Everyone, I am beginning to think, has opinions about tomatoes. This is one of the great unifying forces of humanity. He taught me things with the unconcealed superiority of someone who knows more than they expected to. I let him. It cost me nothing and delighted him enormously, though he would never have admitted to the delight. I learned that you should not water tomatoes from above. The leaves object. That slugs can be deterred by copper tape. Or, in Tyler's preferred method, by staying up late with a torch and removing them by hand into a bucket, which he described with relish and I received with carefully maintained composure. You want me to go outside at midnight with a bucket? I said. It works though, he said. I'm sure it does. I will take this under advisement. He taught me things. I taught him other things. I taught him to make a proper cup of tea, which he had been making entirely incorrectly his whole life. A revelation that appeared to shake him to his foundations. I taught him what taking something under advisement meant. I taught him the names of the birds that visited the garden. The robin who treated my plot as a personal buffet and the blue tits who were engaged in some complex drama in the hedge. Because I had learned these from Kenneth and they had been sitting unused in my head like books on a shelf. I also taught him, gradually and without fanfare, that adults could be tolerated. Possibly even useful. This is not a lesson that comes easily to a boy of 16, and I was careful not to ruin it by making it explicit. The garden was taking shape. Slowly, improbably, the chaos was resolving. We'd cleared the weeds. We'd turned the compost heap into something that actually resembled compost. Dennis next door had unbent enough to lend me his cultivator, and to provide, unsolicited, a 20-minute lecture on soil pH that I understood about a third of. And Tyler summarized afterwards with the accuracy of someone who had understood all of it. He said the soil's too acidic. Tyler translated. We need lime. How do you know all this? He shrugged. Granddad. He talked about it a lot. I used to think it was boring. A pause. I don't now. I pretended to be very interested in the cultivator. It seemed the right thing to do. We planted things. We planted them with the optimism of total amateurs and a cheerful disregard for the number of things that could go wrong. We planted tomatoes. Tyler had views. Courgettes. I had views, shaped largely by Dennis's warnings about their proliferation. And an entire raised bed of salad leaves that came up in such extraordinary abundance that I began distributing them to neighbors like a woman with a leafy compulsion. You've got a lettuce problem, Tyler informed me. I've got a lettuce bounty, I corrected. Same thing, he said, and ate a radish directly from the earth, which made me both impressed and slightly alarmed. His grandmother, whose name turned out to be Pauline, and who was one of those magnificent women who operates entirely on her own terms, approved of our arrangement in her particular way, which was to say nothing whatsoever but occasionally deposit food on my plot. A slice of Caribbean fruitcake here, a Tupperware of rice and peas there. Without explanation or comment. I received these offerings with equal wordlessness. It seemed the correct protocol. Pauline and I had a lot of our best conversations without saying a word. Chapter 4. The Great Courgette Incident and Other Disasters. I should tell you about the courgette incident, because honesty requires it, and also because Tyler has threatened to tell it himself at every opportunity, and his version is significantly less flattering. Dennis had warned me multiple times, in multiple registers, from mild caution to what I can only describe as agricultural prophecy. Courgettes, Dennis had said, in the tone of a man who has seen things, will get away from you. They are not to be trusted. I had nodded, and thanked him, and planted 6 courgette plants. 6. Experienced gardeners reading this will already understand what happened. For the rest of you, courgettes, once established, do not so much grow as erupt. They produce with the cheerful disregard of something that has never once in its botanical history considered moderation. Within 6 weeks, I had courgettes the size of my forearm. Within 8 weeks, I had courgettes the size of things you might use to threaten someone. Tyler arrived one Saturday morning, surveyed the situation, and said, "Margaret," in the specific tone of someone addressing a situation that has escalated beyond reasonable response. "I know," I said. "There's one the size of a." "I know. How did you let it?" Tyler. "Right." We harvested 47 courgettes that weekend. 47. I put a sign at the gate. "Free courgettes, please." And they still piled up. I left bags of them on neighbors' doorsteps like a very specific kind of haunting. I brought them to the church hall. I gave 12 to Dennis, who accepted them with the dignified restraint of a man who had told me so. Tyler put 3 in my car boot without telling me. I only discovered this a week later, which is a sentence I would prefer never to have occasion to write again. "You," I told him, "are absolutely terrible." He grinned. It was a real grin. Unguarded, delighted with itself. And it was the first time I'd seen his face do that particular thing. He looked, briefly, about 12 years old. "It was funny though," he said. It absolutely was not. It was a little bit. But the courgette incident was not actually the disaster. The disaster came in July, on a Thursday evening, when I arrived at the plot to water and found that someone had pulled up half my tomato plants. Not weeds. The tomatoes. 6 plants, root and all, tossed to the side. I stood looking at it for a long moment. Then I sat down on the upturned bucket I'd taken to keeping by the gate. Because knees are not what they were. And tried to decide what to feel. Grief felt excessive. Fury felt appropriate but impractical. I settled on a kind of tired bafflement. Tyler arrived the next Saturday and stopped dead. "What happened?" I explained. He walked the length of the plot, looking at the damage, and his face did something complicated. "Who'd do that?" "I don't know. Could have been anyone. Could have been an accident, though it's hard to see how pulling up 6 tomato plants is accidental." He was quiet for a while. Then, "I might know who." A longer pause. I waited. "There's a couple of lads who come in sometimes. At night. They don't do anything, usually, they just." He stopped. "I've been with them before. Not for a while. But I know them." I had the sense to not make this into anything larger than it was. "Could you talk to them?" He looked at me like I'd suggested something absurd. Then he looked away. "Maybe. No obligation," I said. "It's just tomatoes." We can replant. He was quiet the rest of the morning. But at lunchtime, eating our customary sandwiches on the bench by the gate. Pauline had sent jerk chicken, I had contributed, less impressively, egg and cress. He said, unprompted. They're just bored. They've got nowhere to go either. I said. Doesn't make it right. No. Just. He turned a corner of his sandwich over. It's boring being a teenager in this neighborhood. There's nothing to do. There's this, I said. He looked at me. I'm here because my nan makes me come. I know. And yet, here you are. I took a sip of tea. Also here. 6 weeks ago you couldn't identify a courgette by sight. Now you're an expert. I still think you should have seen the one in the boot coming. Tyler. Right. No more tomatoes were touched after that. I don't know what he said to his friends, and I didn't ask. Some things don't need to be examined too closely. Chapter 5. What the Garden Grows. By September, the plot was unrecognizable. Not in an Instagram perfect, magazine spread way. Nothing so tidy as that. More in the way that something that was broken and left for dead had become, against most reasonable expectation, alive. The tomatoes. The second planting. Had come in red and abundant. The salad bed had been managed to a point where I was no longer giving lettuce to strangers with the desperation of someone managing a crisis. We'd planted kale, which Tyler had been skeptical about. It tastes like the concept of effort. And which had vindicated itself entirely by October when he ate a bowl of it sautéed with garlic, and looked, against his will, impressed. We'd planted sunflowers along the south-facing fence, mostly on a whim, and they had grown to a height that made Dennis make an approving sound, which was the horticultural equivalent of a standing ovation. Pauline had begun stopping by our plot specifically rather than in passing, which I understood to be significant. She brought her folding chair one Saturday and simply sat in it for an hour, watching us work, eating a slice of her own fruitcake with the serenity of a woman who has arranged the world to her satisfaction. You two are funny, she said, at one point. Tyler and I exchanged a look. Are we? I said. She smoothed her skirt. Kenneth would have liked this. I hadn't expected that. You knew Kenneth? He was in the garden a few times, back when he first joined. Nice man. Talked too much about bottle openers. I laughed. A real one. Surprised out of me. That is accurate. He said his wife would have been good at this. Said she had the temperament for it. She gave me a look that suggested the case was now closed and any further comment would be redundant. I looked at the plot. At the tomatoes. At the ridiculous abundance of it, the improbability of it. The fact that I had grown food from dirt with my own hands. Me, a woman who had nearly killed Gerald the succulent through aggressive hovering. Kenneth, you absolute idiot. I thought, with tremendous affection. You could have just told me. But perhaps it had to be discovered rather than told. Some things are like that. On the last Saturday of September, Tyler arrived with 3 friends. This was not what I had been expecting. The friends were boys of roughly his age. 2 of them looking at my plot with the wariness of people being assessed, and 1. Shorter, younger looking. Staring at the sunflowers with an expression of complete, unself-conscious wonder. This is Marcus, Tyler said, indicating the shortest one. And Dion, and Callum. He said this with the elaborate casualness of someone who has rehearsed an introduction. I said you might show them what we've been doing. I looked at them. They looked at me with the specific expression of teenagers waiting to be judged. Right, I said. Well, the kale needs cutting. And those beds at the back want turning over before we put the winter veg in. Do any of you know what a fork is? Marcus, who had been staring at the sunflowers, turned to me. Are those things for eating? The big flowers? The seeds, yes. When they dry out. That's mad, he said. Not disrespectfully. Genuinely delighted. That's properly mad. Tyler caught my eye. He was trying not to look pleased with himself, and failing. We worked until the light went golden and then amber and then started to think about giving out entirely. The five of us spread across the plot in companionable near silence, punctuated by the sounds of digging and Dennis next door giving quiet, unsolicited commentary on our technique. Better. Still too shallow. Better. Pauline materialized at some point with a bag of patties and the air of someone who had been expecting this development for some time. Marcus ate 4 of them. He had the appetite of a teenage boy and the manners, under pressure from Pauline's expression, of someone trying quite hard. Callum, who was 16 and had barely spoken all afternoon, turned out to know a significant amount about composting. His dad, he mentioned with great offhandedness, had worked on a farm. He used to talk about it all the time. I thought it was boring. He paused. It's not that boring. I thought about Kenneth and his allotment that he'd never quite got round to. About how things skipped generations, or were transmitted without our knowing, or lay dormant like seeds in winter soil waiting for the right conditions. It isn't, is it? I said. Tyler, who was on his 4th tomato eaten directly from the vine. I had entirely given up remarking on this habit. Looked over at me. Same time next week? I considered the plot. The kale, the sunflowers, the ridiculous abundance of it. The fact that I had mud under my fingernails and that Gerald the succulent was still alive and that somehow, in this half-acre of former chaos, I had found a thing I hadn't known I was looking for. Same time next week, I said. And Tyler. Bring more people if you like. We're putting the garlic in. Everyone should experience garlic. What if they're boring? Then they can do the weeding. Weeding is very good for boring people. What does it do? I thought about it. The resistance, and the give, and the small triumphant hold of a root pulled whole from the earth. It turns them into interesting people, I said. Eventually. He considered this. Then he nodded, with the air of someone filing it away. The September light went the final shade of gold that autumn light has when it is showing off, and Pauline poured more tea from her inexhaustible thermos, and Marcus was still looking at the sunflowers, and the garden. Kenneth's garden, my garden, all of ours now. Rustled gently in the early evening wind, alive with whatever it is that gardens hold in them when they are properly tended. Gerald is on the windowsill at home. He looks much better these days. I think, perhaps, I've got the temperament for this after all.